It was March 1929. Joan Lowell, the fresh, new best-selling author, stood aboard the ocean liner Ile-de-France in a party thrown in her honor. The Daily Illinois State Journal reported, "A full-rigged ship was her nursery, a flour bag her first nightgown, a canvas hammock her cradle, and the ship's sailmaker her nurse. She was raised large on milk from Norfolk Island goats, and now, at 26, Skipper Joan has licked the world." Skipper Joan has set down her life in a book. It is The Cradle of the Deep, to be published by Simon & Schuster early in March, and it promises to be one of the literary sensations of the year. Theatrical and movie rights already have been sold. Within 2 years, it is estimated, Skipper Joan will have a bank account of more than $200,000. For one brilliant moment, as flashbulbs snapped, Joan Lowell was the American dream. But in a flash, it would all be gone. This is the true story of a Hollywood legend, hoaxes, and an unsinkable star. I'm your host, Ronan Rooney. You're listening to the fifth and final part of Rise and Fall of the Star of Bengal, presented by Wrangell History Unlocked. Today's episode, The Captain's Daughter. She was born Helen Joan Wagner on November 23, 1902, in the city of Berkeley, California. She was the seventh child of Nicholas and Emma Wagner. Her family life was marked by a series of tragedies that she never discussed. Years before Helen was born, her parents' first three children, Philip, Albert, and Annette, ages 7, 3, and 1, died within days of each other from diphtheria. Nicholas and Emma Wagner went on to have more children: Harold, Lowell, Phyllis, Helen, and Francis. When little Helen was 5 years old, her brother Harold was struck by a train just days before Christmas. Doctors operated on Harold's fractured skull, and he seemed to be making a miraculous recovery. Harold Wagner passed away on New Year's Eve 1907 at the age of 12. He is buried with Philip, Albert, and Annette. Nine months after Harold's death, Nicholas Wagner was nearly killed in Alaska when his ship, the Star of Bengal, wrecked on the rocks of Coronation Island. 111 men died, and Nicholas Wagner was dragged from the water unconscious. He came back to San Francisco bruised, beaten, broken, and bitter about being let go from his job with the Alaska Packers Association. The Wagners moved where Nicholas found work. When Helen was 12, Nicholas Wagner once again narrowly survived a shipwreck in Alaska, this time the sailing ship Paramita, which dragged anchors and hit a reef along the Aleutian Islands. In 1917, at the age of 14, Helen Wagner went on the trip that changed her life forever. Nicholas Wagner was captain of the Minnie A. Kane, a cargo schooner bound for Australia. He brought his wife and children along. This was Helen's first taste of life at sea. The 80-day trip to Australia was memorable for many reasons. The Tacoma Daily Ledger. Henry Myers, better known locally as Suicide Myers, a character well known to the police, who was one of the crew of the vessel on the outward voyage, succeeded in hanging himself. In Australia, things got worse. While the Minnie A. Kane sat at harbor, the ship burst into flames. Firemen doused the Minnie A. Kane, causing the ship to list to the side and burn to the edges of the water. Repairs would take months. The fire raised suspicions. Nicholas Wagner offered £100 to anyone with information. The Wagners enrolled their children in Australian schools for their temporary stay. One of Helen's classmates recalled, "Both girls were clever and intelligent, but Helen was the more brilliant and interesting. Helen had strong and original artistic ability which won the admiration of the other pupils. It was an inspiration to hear Helen sing "My Country 'Tis of Thee" and "The Star-Spangled Banner." She felt every word she uttered, and her whole being was suffused with a patriotic love and a pride that lit up her shining eyes. When workers billed Captain Wagner for the repairs to the Minnie A. Kane, he accused them of extortion, and he refused to pay. Australian authorities seized the ship. Captain Wagner said, "So, you arrested my ship, have you? You disgraced my ship and myself." Nicholas Wagner won the case in court on a technicality, and the repairman paid his fees. The Minnie A. Kane soon left for America, but not before learning the cause of the fire. It was an act of terrorism by their own cabin boy, Harry Shipwreck. Authorities accused Shipwreck of being with the International Workers of the World and bombing the ship on Labor Day because it carried food for European allies in the midst of World War I. Helen Joan Wagner never talked about Harry Shipwreck or the firebombing. She never talked about her brother who died when she was young or the siblings she lost before she was born. Instead, Helen Joan Wagner would create a world of her own, one far more exotic than her own life. And to live this life, she needed only look down the California coast to the place where people make stories and stories make people. Hollywood.
Hip hooray! I feel delighted. Yesterday I was invited to a swell affair. All the movie stars were there. Oh, what fun! The party lasted till the break of dawn. Famous players turned to cabareters, how they fooled and carried on. Dancing at that moving picture ball. And Charlie Chaplin with his feet stepped all over poor Blanche Sweet. Dancing at that moving picture ball.
In 1920, World War I was over, and the Roaring Twenties were just beginning. At the age of 18, Helen Wagner stepped into the busy streets of Hollywood, a place where beautiful young women just like her came every day, hoping to strike fame and riches. One newspaper described Helen: "A beauty of an extraordinary type, her complexion being a coppery bronze, while her eyes are a dark brown, and her hair is chestnut." She signed on as an extra in a movie, Souls for Sale, but she told the Oakland Tribune she was the second lead actress. The paper wrote, "Berkeley girl chosen for big role in Rupert Hughes' film. She is an adept swimmer, and it was her prowess in the water which first attracted the attention of Hughes to her at Santa Monica 3 years ago while she was contesting for honors in a swim meet." In reality, Helen Wagner was one of 600 extras huddled inside a circus tent out in the desert. But she still managed to make the papers, if for all the wrong reasons. The Oakland Tribune. "The tent had been saturated with gasoline, set afire, and blown down with wind machines, while 500 or 600 extras rushed for the exits. A 6-horse team, pulling a circus wagon in flames, ran away and into the crowd of actors. The most seriously injured was Joan Lowell, young actress, who was given emergency treatment at the studio and then hurried to the hospital in Culver City. Helen Wagner was trampled inside the flaming tent, but Joan Lowell emerged like a phoenix from the ashes. She would use this name for the rest of her life. Her big break left her broken. She worked as a waitress, eating the leftover scraps her customers left behind. To become a stenographer, she learned how to type, a skill she would put to good use later. She worked in a Hollywood wardrobe department. But by the age of 20, she had little to show for her 2 years in Hollywood. She set about giving Joan Lowell a backstory, one that would turn heads. In 1922, the Alexandria Gazette published a full feature of the up-and-coming talented Joan Lowell and her amazing life story. The old schooner Minnie A. Kane, which pokes all around the Pacific Ocean, is more of a home to Joan Lowell than any place else. She has spent 16 of her 19 years traveling on the vessel, of which her father is skipper. She was taken aboard when 3 months old and learned to swim as soon as to walk. Tutored by her father and oft to her own devices for amusement, Helen has developed an imagination that is helping her win success now as a scenario writer. Joan's imagination really was incredible. Her story turned heads, defied belief, and tantalized readers' imagination. It was perfect publicity fodder. Joan kept elaborating. The Los Angeles Times. Joan never saw another girl until she was 16. Reared on the bounding main by her father, captain of a trade schooner, she was proficient in the arts of seamanship and once harpooned a whale single-handed. Spending her childhood in tropic waters, Joan grew up with a burning desire for companionship with other girls, of whom she had heard seamen talk. And when her blossoming womanhood brought complications to the placid hearts of the old salts on his schooner, her father decided to ship her back to civilization. For a glowing publicity photo, Joan posed topless, her arms and sea kelp wrapped around her. She provided the caption, "While cruising on her father's trading schooner, Joan Lowell was offered the lotus flower coronet that marks the queen of the Atafu Islands, but she turned it down, together with the courtship of King Omaiku, the 7-foot ruler of the tropical kingdom, to follow a career in pictures." In 2017, Kevin Young published Bunk, The Rise of Hoaxes, Humbug, Plagiarists, Phonies, Postfacts, and Fake News. It contains a detailed, thoughtful analysis of Joan's use of stereotypes. Quoting from the book, "Her improbably yet predictable, unlikely yet unavoidable natives are all part of the typical hoax package, yet too often part of the actual travelogue too. To have left out such cliched elements would have aroused suspicion much earlier." However improbable, Joan's lies worked. In 1923, she landed her first leading actress role in Loving Lies, a movie set at sea aboard a sailing ship, written by a man named Thompson Buchanan, with whom she would cross paths later. Joan and the movie won rave reviews. One newspaper said, "Joan Lowell brings to the screen and reality a girl of the sea, free from the artificialities of life, having been reared from a babe to the age of 17 aboard her father's 4-masted seagoing sloop." She followed up by filming in several westerns in Mexico, where she was made Queen of Tijuana's 4th of July festivities and paraded through the town. By the age of 21, she told the Los Angeles Evening Post,
"Circumstances compelled Daddy to take me to sea with him when I was a 3-month babe. Everyone said I'd die. He fed me on dried milk, kept me clean, and trusted to God. Look at me now."
In its profile of Joan Lowell, the Post reported, "Shipwreck, tempest, and scurvy, the shadowy perils and romance of the South Seas, have beaten against this slim young nymph in a succession of adventures which single her out even among remarkable folk. Detailed embellishments of all this and much more, the astonishing Miss Lowell, now 19, tells with the naive directness that shames conventions. A girl strangely cultured for all her unrestraint, steeped in biblical and classical lore imbibed in ship's cabins, strong, fearless, clear-eyed."
I cussed with the best of 'em. I could steer ships with my toes. Shirts and overalls were my only clothes. I understand rough men. They treat me with utter respect. I practiced with prune juice so that I could spit tobacco as far and straight as they. I have knocked men down with my fists. They regard me as their equal. When scurvy struck us, I drank the blood of a porpoise with the others."
A few months later, Joan told her hometown newspaper, the San Francisco Chronicle,
"Besides my father, the only men I knew were Poles and Swedes and other members of the crew. They were a primitive lot, hairy and tattooed. My father himself was a hard man, hard as nails. He was the despot of our little vessel, a tyrant kinging it over his own small monarchy.
If Joan portrayed herself as anything but ordinary, she portrayed her father, Nicholas Wagner, as extraordinary. Joan's mother did not receive the same treatment. The October 1923 San Francisco Chronicle. Joan's mother had died soon after the baby's birth, and as her father looked down at the atom of the cradle, he swore that the child should live. Her cradle was the tarpaulin and an old sou'wester. Her nurse was a pig-tailed sailor with a tattooed arm, and her only food at first was goat's milk. In early 1924, she was given a screen test, then a second, then a third, and a fourth, before being signed to a 3-year film contract by Associated Authors. The backstories paid off. Joan Lowell was officially a working Hollywood actress. The same year, Joan was cast by the biggest movie star in the world, Charlie Chaplin, to appear in his biggest movie yet, Gold Rush. It told the story of a tramp in the Klondike Gold Rush who falls in love with a dance hall girl. While this was a huge opportunity for Joan, she learned that all that glitters is not gold. When 15-year-old actress Lita Grey heard Charlie Chaplin was casting brunettes for the film, Lita Grey appealed directly to Charlie Chaplin and landed the lead part of the film. Chaplin cast Joan Lowell as the second lead actress. Both women were young, of a similar height, build, hair, and complexion. Chaplin cast the two women as best friends. Chaplin filmed Gold Rush in remote, snowy, mountainous California. This was Chaplin's biggest, most expensive production yet. Midway through the filming, Chaplin isolated, groomed, and impregnated 15-year-old Lita Grey. Lita Grey wrote in her memoir,
"It's hardly a secret that Charlie had a penchant for young girls. He approached them as projects, and indeed cared for some of them. He liked to cultivate them, to gain their trust, to be their first, never their second or third lover, and to create them as scrupulously as he created a motion picture."
Charlie Chaplin fired Lita Grey from the film and married her. He cast Georgia Hale as the new lead and began a relationship with her shortly thereafter. Joan and the cast of Gold Rush returned to the mountains of California to reshoot the movie all over again with their new leading actress. And Joan Lowell never worked in Hollywood again. It's never been clear why. She was only 1 year into a 3-year contract. Years later, Joan remarked,
I wish I had $1 for every one of those Hollywood lice and pants who sided up to me and offered a cozy little apartment without a wedding ring. There was something slimy and smutty and pallid about the lusts of Hollywood. The movies were pretty mean to me, and now I'm glad to have a chance to thumb my nose to them.
Putting Hollywood behind her, Joan announced her next move, the Los Angeles Evening Express. There are very few girls who would sacrifice the opportunity of playing lead roles opposite Movieland's best-known leading man and a salary of $750 a week to become an extra in a stage presentation. This may sound strange, but it is just what Joan Lowell has done. Miss Lowell did this just for the chance of getting on the stage, starting from the bottom. Joan played a sea captain's daughter in the New York City production of Port-a-London. A Brooklyn newspaper raved, "We nearly forgot to mention the sudden thrilling shrieks which Miss Lowell emitted from time to time, and also the graceful way in which she fell across the floor each time she was knocked down." Joan sang sea ditties on the radio. She continued to embellish her backstory.
I'd like to tell the world just what a girl's life really is. I could swear 4 straight minutes and never repeat. I was strong as an ox and used to help all the time. But the thing I was rated highest for was because I could spit 4 feet. I used prune juice instead of tobacco. Spitting well as I did put me on a regular footing with the sailors. My own father never kissed me. Afterward, he said he wanted me to be boyish.
One reporter noted, "Her speech is excellent, except for the ease with which she handles maritime terms. You might easily believe she had just come from a convent." Joan joined the cast of Detroit's Bonstelle Playhouse, playing the role of the young, beautiful ingenue. She reconnected with Thompson Buchanan, the man she met 3 years before, who wrote her first big role in Loving Lies. At 49, Thompson Buchanan was twice her age. He was a veteran stage and screenwriter. He was a dapper, well-dressed man of the city, but he could write like a sailor and throw around nautical terms. The potential was clear. He could write, and she could act. On October 10, 1927, the couple married in secret at the Bonstell Playhouse. Whether Thompson Buchanan knew her stories were bunk or not may always be a mystery, but he used them. Thompson Buchanan began work on a stage play set at sea aboard a great sailing ship about a young woman named Joan who grows up aboard her father's ship and falls in love with a member of the crew, a man who is secretly a writer. Joan became Thompson Buchanan's muse. He brought out the qualities he loved about her, her beauty, spirit, and toughness. From the start, he intended Joan to play the lead in his masterpiece. Thompson Buchanan gave the play a grand name as well, one that would look good on a Broadway marquee. Star of Bengal. At the beginning of 1928, Joan announced she was leaving Detroit to join her husband in New York City, where she would assume the lead in his play, Star of Bengal. When she got there, the play still had no theater. Joan took acting jobs in New York City and New Orleans. She told one New Orleans paper she'd caught scurvy at 14 and lost every tooth in her mouth. She claimed to have fought hurricanes and man-eating sharks, and to have been deaf for 2 years after jumping in the water and rupturing her eardrums. And she was no longer raised aboard the Minnie A. Kane.
There wasn't any coddling the baby girl on the Star of Bengal, but any sailor respected me when I could climb the rigging faster than he could, when I could haul on a rope as hard as he could, when I could steer a trick at the wheel the way he could, and when I could spit a curve to windward and swear as well as he could. I earned their respect. I was chewing plug tobacco when I was 12.
The Charleston Evening Post tells what happened next. Mr. Schuster, of the publishing firm of Simon & Schuster, got immediately interested in what Joan went on to tell her audience. He wanted her to write about her life in just the way she told about it. She wrote exactly 5,000 words of what was to be Chapter 11 in the book, and demanded $25 in payment. Simon & Schuster loved it. For the sample, Joan pulled out an old family story from her father, the wreck of the Star of Bengal. Simon & Schuster were sold. They offered an advance and agreed to publish her book. Joan had only to thank the Star of Bengal for opening the door. Now, there were 2 typewriters clicking away in the Buchanan-Lowell household.
Chapter 1. I spit a curve in the wind. She ain't any water rat, ma'am. She's a flower girl, she is, with the tropic heavens for a hothouse and the scolding of a storm for her when she's bad.
Near the end of 1928, Joan poured herself and years of well-crafted lies into her book. She gave the book a name from a familiar hymn, Cradle of the Deep. Joan wrote she was nursed by a goat until 2, and raced her pet seagull named Saltpork down the deck of the ship. When scurvy struck, Joan said,
I felt like I was dying from the outside in. I would sit for hours and peel dead skin off my body.
And she wrote her father, Captain Nicholas Wagner, as godlike and fearless, a brutal but fair dictator. She described him striking crew members, kidnapping men at ports and pressing them into service, and shooting a giant waterspout with a rifle, destroying it and saving the ship. Nestled in the middle of Cradle of the Deep is a dark story from her father's past.
Chapter 11. The Sea Gives Up Its Dead. San Francisco in April. High out on the network of masts and rigging of ships that made the waterfront look like a black spiderweb across the skyline, jerked the blue house flag with its flying fishtails of the famous Star, queen of the fleet of sailing ships in the Alaska salmon trade.
Of the steamships that towed the Star out to sea, Joan wrote,
The tugs Hattie H. and Kayak were to tow the Star out. Nearly all the crew of these two tugs were drunk before they left the dock.
Joan wrote the steamships towing the Star panicked.
No sooner had he dropped the anchors than the tugboats, instead of fighting for the ship and the lives of the men on board, cut their towing hawsers and ran for it, deliberately steaming away at full speed.
Joan described scenes never before shared in the newspapers or the investigation. She described the last meeting of the ship's officers.
Down in the stuffy red plush cabin, the men sat around the chart table. The clerk of the cannery, pale and husky-voiced, asked my father to take the money he had, $900, and give it to his family when my father reached San Francisco. Another man asked father to take a message to his wife, and still another broke out into vile profanity. A huge man, one of the wealthy owners of the cannery, forgot his pose of dignity and knelt down on the cabin floor and prayed like a frightened child.
Joan shared a heartbreaking, never-before-published detail about the brothers Hansen, who argued over who would risk their life for the other.
4 young men responded to his call for volunteers. One of them, the younger, couldn't swim. His older brother urged him not to go. He, the older one, would go, for he was a strong swimmer. The younger boy would not hear his pleading and went first. The good swimmer was drowned just out of reach a few moments later.
Joan offered her explanation why the Alaska Packers Association rallied behind the steamship captains and against her father.
If the responsibility of the wreck was fastened on the 2 captains of the tugboats, the corporation faced enormous damage suits from the families and dependents of the 111 dead men. So, the owners used every bit of their influence and resources to protect the guilty tugboat captains.
She ended the chapter with this.
He still carries the bitterness and hate in his heart.
This was an exceptional chapter, the only story not told from Joan's own supposed first-hand experience. It paints her stoic, stern father in a sympathetic light. To give the book a dramatic ending, Joan described the Minnie A. Kane bursting into flames at sea and swimming 3 miles to shore with a family of kittens on her back.
If I had to swim, no nightgown was going to get in my way to drag me down. I tore it from me, but the drenched kitten still clung to my flesh. I filled my lungs with a deep breath and jumped out of the lifeboat. When I came up in the choppy sea, I was conscious of only the pain caused by the salt water on my bleeding cuts and scratches. Each stroke I took was like a knife cut, and I couldn't shake the drowning kittens off. Perhaps to those cats I owe my life, for the pain made me so mad I fought on and on.
After 6 weeks of typing away, Joan Lowell had her manuscript complete. Near the end of 1928, she approached the new publishing company, Simon & Schuster, who leapt at the extraordinary, allegedly true story of a beautiful young woman growing up at sea. When the Book of the Month Club reached out, everything changed. The club selected Cradle of the Deep as its official book for March 1929 and ordered 75,000 copies. Cradle of the Deep became an instant bestseller. Through gasps and guffaws, shock and disbelief, the American public fell in love with Joan Lowell, and Hollywood took notice. Hollywood director D.W. Griffith paid $75,000 to make Joan Lowell's upcoming play, Star of Bengal, into a movie. Never mind that the play had still never seen an audience. Joan and D.W. Griffith were photographed together aboard the luxury ocean liner Ile-de-France, reserved for a party hosted by Simon & Schuster. It was the fever pitch of the Roaring '20s, and Joan's career was hot. But the fever would break. Tucked away in a corner of Maine, Lincoln Colcord read Cradle of the Deep and thought, "An imaginative moron who tells absurd tales and actually believes them to be true." Unlike Joan, Lincoln Colcord actually had been raised at sea aboard his father's sailing ship, and he immediately recognized Joan's work as a piece of nautical nonsense. Lincoln Colcord had been asked to write an endorsement of the book. Instead, he wrote a blistering review of the book for Time magazine, laying out 51 problems with Cradle of the Deep. Before publishing his list, Simon & Schuster called him to meet with Joan in their offices. Lincoln Colcord remembered. "Joan had been sitting on the desk in the middle of the room, swinging her legs. Suddenly she sprang to the floor and came at me. When she advanced to within a few feet of me, she drew herself up, and looked me over scornfully from head to foot, in a voice of withering contempt."
Oh, if you weren't so old! God damn it! No one has ever called me a liar before.
It was as if Lincoln Colcord had broken a spell. Now, reporters from across the country dug up Joan's past and came up with a name: Helen Wagner. They even found the Minnie A. Kane. It hadn't sunk, as Joan wrote. It was sitting at a dock in California. One newspaper dubbed the whole scandal Cradle of the Dope. Simon & Schuster offered refunds. The scandal only drew more readers. One critic, Arnold Mulder, initially suspected someone else wrote Joan's book. When the scandal came out, he took this as confirmation. "I suspected from the first that while she had some experience on the sea, she had told her yarn to a trained writer and that the latter had built up a corking sea yarn." Joan was lying in Cradle of the Deep, but these were her lies, nobody else's. She would spend the rest of her life proving herself as a writer. Joan's fiercest defender was her 71-year-old father, Nicholas Wagner. "One of them said my daughter never was on the sea, did he? Well, tell him to come around here and I'll change his mind. Oh, and he said he didn't think I was a sailor either, did he? Well, tell him he'll get a good punch in the nose." Riding Joan's wave of infamy, Thompson Buchanan finally found a theater for his play Star of Bengal. It wasn't quite Broadway. It was Hoboken, New Jersey, across the river from Broadway. The owner, Mr. Morley, was also on the committee of the Book of the Month Club. Star of Bengal was a large production with 22 actors, a ship setting, and Joan playing the lead. A large oil painting of Joan hung in the lobby beneath the Star of Bengal marquee. Moments before the curtains went up on opening night, Mr. Morley announced to the audience that Joan had applied for jobs at the theater in the past, but been turned down. But here she was, performing in a play written by none other than her husband. And then the curtains went up.
Landlubber ahoy!
For 3 weeks,
I'm not going to live always on ships. I gotta steer my own course, or I'll never make port, the port of my dreams.
she played the person she pretended to be in Cradle of the Deep.
Have you faced scurvy in a doldrum? Have you heard the squeal of a stuck porpoise and drunk its blood when there wasn't any water? Have you seen an octopus caught by a rock mussel fighting for its life?
In a passionate, tropical romance.
Only I thought someday I was going to dance the dance of the virgins for you.
Every night she shook her hips and waved her arms.
Star of Bengal, ahoy!
And played out the story of forbidden love aboard her father's ship.
You can't do nothing to him, Father, 'cause of what it would do to me. I'm gonna have a baby. His baby.
That all falls apart at the end.
No, Dan, I can't go on living with you. Not until you learn what makes life worth living. This is goodbye.
Some reviews were okay. She was a sailor and the captain's daughter, just as the book said, and now nobody can deny it. Your reviewer, a good deal of a landlubber himself, had no way of telling whether Miss Lowell's seamanship was that of a sailoress, born to the purple, or whether it was just good acting. Some were harsh. The fact the play is terrible, and the star just as bad, would be passed off without much comment had not Mr. Morley appeared serious when he promised that something unusual in an artistic way was to be revealed. Ship ahoy, which may give you some idea how the Star of Bengal was received. The constant reminder of that old devil sea produced an effect closely resembling seasickness. The play lacks the lusty quality which the Hoboken thrillers have supplied to date, and is not likely to please the peanut-tossing slummers. The plan had been for Star of Bengal to run 3 weeks, then make a triumphant leap across the river into Broadway. It never made it. After 3 weeks, Star of Bengal came to an end. It was over. Rumors speculated the failure would bring down the Lyric Theater, too. But things were about to get much, much worse.
They used to tell me I was building a dream, and so I followed the mob. When there was earth to plow or guns to bear, I was always there, right on the job. They used to tell me I was building a dream, with peace and glory ahead. Why should I be standing in line, just waiting for bread? Once I built a railroad, I made it run, made it race against time. Once I built a railroad, now it's done. Brother, can you spare a dime?
2 weeks after Star of Bengal came crashing down, so did the stock market, on what may be the worst day in American history. Black Tuesday, October 29, 1929. Joan was in New York City to watch it happen, as a single crash wiped out the fortunes of Americans, leading some to leap to their death from New York City's high-rises. The Roaring Twenties were dead. The Great Depression had begun. Joan fled to Pennsylvania and announced she was getting divorced.
I have nothing but admiration for Mr. Buchanan, but I like to live life quietly here in the country with my horses and my books and my dreams. Well, Mr. Buchanan likes city life, Broadway.
The couple reconciled for Christmas and sat for an uncomfortable staged publicity photo, surrounded by unwrapped baby toys. Joan's eyes looked heavy, and her smile forced. Thompson gazed awkwardly at the floor. The reunion didn't last. Joan used an old Hollywood trick and got a no-questions divorce in Mexico. Joan Lowell and Thompson Buchanan had no children together. Only Star of Bengal, a failed play from a failed marriage. Joan never stopped defending her story.
Believe it or not, I was on the sea.
Joan said something which historian Garson O'Toole believes may be the very first time this exact phrase appeared in print. It goes,
You've got to be twice as good as a man to get half as far.
Joan Lowell plotted an epic comeback to prove herself to the world. She landed a job writing for a Boston newspaper, doing gritty undercover work. She wore wigs and used fake names. While pretending to be an out-of-work actress, which was not that far from the truth, she was assaulted by theater booking agent Morris Levine. The Oakland Tribune wrote, Miss Lowell declared she escaped from his office by a ruse, promising to receive Levine later in her room. When Levine arrived at her lodgings to keep the appointment, burly policemen stepped out of hiding and arrested him. Morris Levine was sentenced to 14 months in jail. Joan published this and other stories in her second book, Gal Reporter. In 1934, Joan Lowell shocked everyone when she announced a 5-year sailing voyage around the world aboard the schooner Black Hawk. She brought along her aging 76-year-old father, Nicholas Wagner, to serve as captain, along with 2 deckhands and a German shepherd. The voyage lasted 6 months before the Black Hawk wrecked. Incredibly, when Joan and the group returned to the United States, they had reels and reels of film footage.
And every foot is authentic. The storms, the battle between my dog and the octopus, the turtle hatching, the Mayan ruins and all. No faking, no dummies, no studio shots.
The 5-year voyage was a ruse, just to film Joan's next movie, Adventure Girl. Joan and her father, Nicholas Wagner, dramatized disasters at sea, life and death peril, and scenes familiar to readers of Cradle of the Deep. Here's a clip of Joan talking in the movie.
It was a lovely spring morning when we started out from New York in the Black with a crew of 2, Bill and Otto, my father, as grand a skipper as ever yelled shove off, and myself.
Some film historians consider Adventure Girl the first fake documentary, a style of filmmaking that would grow in popularity. Audiences panned Adventure Girl, but even Joan's failures made her more famous. In May 1935, a torrential downpour flooded the Republican River in southern Nebraska, turning a dust bowl into waves of surging mud, demolishing homes and farms, leaving a wake trail of death. Desperate Nebraskans scrambled to organize relief. Into the breach entered Joan Lowell, a bona fide celebrity who agreed to appear at a benefit. In less than 2 hours, the organizers sold 150 tickets at $1 apiece. She was greeted and photographed at the airport and visited the devastation, writing for the newspaper,
Over to the west, I saw grim tombstones of a whole community's life and splintered windmills standing as sentinels where once lush valleys bore produce, and stalwart toilers of the soil form the backbone of homesteads that make a state a nation.
Joan wowed Omaha. She dazzled locals with her characteristic bravado and unbelievable stories. Newspapers reported, She is now a pilot, but abandoned flying when Amelia Earhart flew the Atlantic and her goal vanished. In Guatemala, Miss Lowell was asked to take the lead in a movie, Adventure Girl. During the production, she visited an orphanage, saw a small boy who had lost an arm, adopted him, and took him back to New York. He is now in school there. Miss Lowell is the only woman who has ever made a trip on a United States Coast Guard cutter in pursuit of rum runners off the Atlantic coast. During an impromptu address to a women's luncheon, Joan announced Rolling Down to Rio, a 41-day South American cruise helmed by none other than herself. One woman signed up. In the pit of despair, Joan Lowell brought some Hollywood glamour and celebrity glitz to the downtrodden masses. Despite her scandals, Joan Lowell was the hero of Omaha. Shortly after starring in his daughter's film, Nicholas Wagner moved into a retirement home for old mariners, the Sailors' Snug Harbor in Staten Island, New York. He died on August 3, 1943. He was 81 years old. It was July 1957. Joan Lowell, 55, sat in a Brazilian jail cell, accused of passing $15,000 in bad checks.
I am a victim of persecution.
She had a rational explanation.
I put out the checks under threats from an organized gang. They demanded checks and loans with interest of 50 and up to 80%. For a long time now, I have been suffering an underground campaign.
The judge believed Joan's story and let her go. This was one of the many adventures of the woman who moved to Brazil in the late 1930s and began turning undeveloped jungle into coffee plantations. She sold plots of land to Hollywood movie stars, who sometimes arrived to find the land in dispute. She married again, this time to a man who didn't just talk like a sea captain. He truly was a sea captain. Leek Bowen. She wrote about their lives together in her third and final book, Promised Land. In 1961, Leek Bowen was struck by a bus and killed. 6 years later, on November 7, 1967, Joan Lowell Bowen passed away. She was 64 years old. She is buried in Anápolis, Brazil. In the center of all her lies, he was the one true thing. Joan Lowell adored her father. She built him up in legend and stature. She made him the hero of Cradle of the Deep. She put him in her movie. She patterned herself after him. She wanted to be so much like him that she lied about who she was. In her fantasy, it was just her and her dad against the world. The Star of Bengal was a tragedy for the Wagner family. Nicholas Wagner nearly died, lost his job, and had to move to find work. Joan never forgot the humiliation. When she was 26, Joan struck back at everyone who doubted her father. She wrote Cradle of the Deep to paint her father as a hero. When it became a bestseller overnight, suddenly Americans were talking about the Star of Bengal all over again. The most well-known version of the Star of Bengal story ever told was written by a 26-year-old woman who wasn't even there. Everyone who studies the Star of Bengal must confront Joan Lowell and all the stories that survive. We must ask, where does the fiction end and the truth begin? Rise and Fall of the Star of Bengal is a Wrangle History Unlocked production. Music from today's episode, Rhapsody in Blue and Mars from the Planets, performed by the President's Own United States Marine Band. Greensleeves and Oh Christmas Tree, performed by Mary Rooney. Stompin' Jazz Night from Epidemic Sounds. Gonzaga Gaucho, performed by Marcus Staub from museopen.org. Music from archive.org. Tiger Rag, performed by Original Dixieland Band. At the Moving Picture Ball, performed by Maurice Burkhart. Sea Songs, performed by the Victor Mixed Chorus. Wedding March, performed by the American Symphony Orchestra. Rocked in the Cradle of the Deep, performed by Wilfred Glenn and J.P. Knight. Brother, Can You Spare a Dime, performed by Bing Crosby. Auld Lang Syne, performed by the Westminster Chimes. Remaining music from the Wikipedia Commons. Lullaby Wound Up Clock by Stefan. The Entertainer, performed by Adam Queerden. Also Sprach Zarathustra by Kevin MacLeod. Funeral of a Marionette, performed by the San Francisco Symphony. Sound effects from epidemicsounds.com. Thanks to our voice talent today, Mary Rooney and Lexi Pranella. Thank you to the Billy Rose Theater Division of the New York Public Library for providing the script for Thompson Buchanan's play, Star of Bengal. Thanks to Bonnie Demersion, Alice Rooney, and Steve Lloyd for offering feedback on early drafts of this episode. Bonnie Demersion is the author of several wonderful books on Wrangle history, and Steve Lloyd is the author of 2 gripping articles about the Star of Bengal, published in 2001 in the Puget Sound Maritime Historical Society's journal, The Sea Chest. You can learn more about the Star of Bengal at wranglehistoryunlocked.com/star. Read a transcript of this episode, see photos, maps, a timeline, and more. Browse around and check out some of our other features from Wrangle's rich past. Thanks to my wife and kids for being patient with me while I've been working on this project. Thanks to everyone in Wrangle and around the world who've been listening. If you've never been to Wrangle, visit sometime. That's all for Rise and Fall of the Star of Bengal. I'm your host, Ronan Rooney. Thanks for listening.